I'm welcoming you on this beautiful cool summer morning to I can't quite say fellow Canadian because I'm an American citizen, but I certainly was educated in Canada. And our speaker today was Neil Alexander, was educated primarily in England and got his PhD there in metallurgy at the University of Birmingham, and has been quite active in Canada. He also was president of Rolls-Royce Civil Nuclear Canada, and is a founder of Bucephalus Consulting, and he'll talk to you a little bit about that. He's a former president of the Organization of Canadian Nuclear Industry, and he favors small modular reactors, but with wisdom, and he will tell us, particularly near the end of his talk, what he hopes for those updated forms of nuclear materials. So I'm looking forward to Neil Alexander's talk. He spoke to us last April, particularly about what they call waste. And so we've heard of him fairly recently, heard from him, and we can anticipate hearing more from him in 2 weeks' time. But today's talk is why Ontario's power needn't be risky, hard to build, or costly. So we're looking forward to your presentation. Neil, you have the floor.
Excellent, Richard. Thank you very much. And a few things there I need to sort of tease out in the introduction. So Richard asked me to give this presentation because he was very interested in the nuclear program in Canada and how it differs from what's happening in the US and the rest of the world. And I wanted to talk to you about other issues that are on my mind regarding communications. And so he mentioned there that I'd given you a previous presentation about what people call waste, but which I want people to refer to as used fuel, because if you use the word waste, it kind of creates a picture in people's minds that is very unhelpful and is not representative of what we actually do. And I'm in the presentation in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to talk a little bit about conspiracy theories and the way people use magicians' tricks to project their conspiracy theories and how that's been unhelpful for the nuclear industry. So that was a good way of introducing it. As Richard says, I've had a reasonable amount of experience in the Canadian nuclear industry, and then kind of set up my own consulting company, Bucephalus Consulting. Richard wanted me to outline why my logo and why the name. So for those of you that aren't Greek scholars, Bucephalus was Alexander the Great's horse. My company does marketing activities, and I picked the logo because I help foreign companies move into Canada, and I help Canadian companies do business elsewhere. So I titled, gave it a buzz line, Taking You to New Territories. And Bucephalus, as Alexander the Great's horse, was what took him to new territories. So it was an internal joke that so far 3 people have understood. So very constructive from that point of view. And although it wasn't intended, it's actually been very helpful in marketing the company, because the first thing people do at conferences is ask me where the name came from. And it allows me to explain what I did without appearing to be doorstepping them and telling them about the company. And so that's where the chess piece came in. And that also sort of provides an illusion of sort of cleverness and knowing what I'm doing, which may or may not be appropriate. My background is one of marketing and sales. My technical expertise is not something that I would wish to trade on. So I want people to understand that before I launch into this presentation. And the other thing is that as Richard said, I didn't grow up in the Canadian nuclear industry. So some of the history may not be as perfect as it could be, but this is the perspective of someone that arrived about 20 years ago and picked up an involvement in it from that point. Just because there's no free lunch, I'll tell you a little bit about the company. I'm presently doing a lot of work on small modular reactor deployment. I'm not at all interested, as you will find out, in the technology, which I think is largely irrelevant. But I am very interested in how we go about making the technology successful. And that, for me, is about preparing the ground so that when we plant them, they can germinate and grow comfortably. And that's an area that, as we'll come to later in the presentation, there is almost no attention being paid to. And I think is a real problem for us, and shows that the nuclear industry has perhaps not learned the lessons that it should have done from the past. I also help, as I said, companies move into the Canadian nuclear industry. I do a lot of work on what I call compelling communications, trying to help people improve their proposals, marketing plans, and their presentations, which is always a dangerous thing when you're making a presentation yourself, because you've then got to follow your rules and do a good job. So I hope I will be able to do that. In fact, though, I have failed in one of my basic rules, and that is to be prepared. And Richard gave me, I think, two and a half months of opportunity to prepare for this presentation, and I left it until last night in the way that I would tell everybody not to do. But that's life, and we have to deal with it sometimes. And then in terms of compelling communications, I train people, advise people, facilitate. Where necessary, I will write, and then I'll help them drive it through to a successful conclusion. But today I'm going to talk about the nuclear industry in Canada. And as I said, I came in here only 20 years ago, so I don't know it from the roots. But I do have a sort of picture as what happened. I think it's useful to understand that. So in the early days of electricity, particularly in Ontario, where I'm based, it started out with hydro. The Niagara Falls hydro station, a tremendous opportunity to produce electricity, and from which people very quickly appreciated the value of electricity and wanted more. So with the basic nuclear station at Niagara Falls, there were then expansions on that, and the first expansion of the electricity system in the region was increasing the hydro capacity. But for people that haven't been here, other than that vast quantity of water falling over Niagara Falls, there isn't a great deal of height in the parts of Ontario that people live in. So there was very limited additional hydro capacity, and people wanted more electricity. So they did what pretty much everybody else in the world was doing at the time, and went to the fossil fuel that was reasonably readily available to them, and that was coal. So the next phase of electricity expansion was in building coal-fired power stations. But Canada also had a fair amount of experience in nuclear, mainly because, as a sort of little quirk of history, Canada was quite a long way away from anywhere that Hitler could bomb. And so America and the UK and Canada were working together on nuclear issues in places that were not accessible to damage that could be done by the Germans during the Second World War. And that was the basis of the nuclear industry starting in Canada. But they built from that experience to build their own style of nuclear reactor, the CANDU reactor. That was the next sort of stage of electricity development in Canada, allowing a fairly extensive expansion of the electricity network, and without building any further fossil fuel-fired stations. CANDU reactors ran, as we'll come to some of the advantages, you can run them quite hard for quite long periods of time. And people that wanted to profit as much as possible from them decided that was an appropriate way to run the plant. And they did have a very successful period of running that way, but it built up problems. Unfortunately, just before those problems started to expose themselves, in an attempt to increase profitability from electricity generation, somebody had the bright idea that they would lay off all of the experienced people to save money. So at a period in the history, there was a time when an awful lot of work needed to be done in order to keep the stations operating, because they had basically driven them too hard for too long without doing sufficient maintenance. When they came to do that, they found that they no longer had the experienced staff working within the organization that were necessary. And so rather reluctantly, there was a decision taken to close a number of the stations while they concentrated on doing the work that was needed to keep the other stations operating. And you'll see the consequences of that in a little bit of a plan that I have in a coming slide on what stations operated and when. After the nuclear closures, there was then a recognition that more electricity was needed, and there was a decision taken that it would be generated by basically wind and solar. The Germans had come and visited the government here, and they had convinced them that wind and solar could pick up all of the slack, and that all of the investment should be moved to wind and solar. So we had something called the Green Energy Act, and a fairly massive expansion in wind and solar capacity in the province. Simultaneously, there were investments being made to restart the nuclear reactors that had been closed. And so they brought in a lot of emissions-free capacity at the same time the Green Energy Act was taking place. And in so doing, they enabled Canada or Ontario to retire all of its coal-fired power stations. And it was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to be able to do that. The government tried to imply that it was done as a result of the wind and solar capacity, but basically, if you look at what was happening, it was the nuclear restarts that enabled them to do that. In fact, the Green Energy Act became so unpopular with the people who had the windmills imposed upon them, and the increases in electricity price that occurred at that time, partially as a result of the Green Energy Act, but also as a result of a lot of other things. But the Green Energy Act took the blame. That government that introduced it became so unpopular, they were not only voted out of Parliament, but they were voted out of being a party. They had so few seats. And the next government, recognizing the way that the political wind was blowing, dropped all of the renewable projects, and they ceased at that point. An action that became possible as a result of reduced electricity usage at that time. So that's a very quick outline of where we got to where we are today. And I'm just going to go through and kind of fill in some of the gaps. So this is the history of CANDO. Started in the 40s with an experimental reactor, zero energy experimental pile, Z. That was at, I can't remember whether.
Chalk River, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's Chalk River. Suddenly dawned on me that could be in Montreal, but it isn't, it's Chalk River.
Okay.
The next experimental ones were NRX and NRU. And the National Research Universal Reactor gained a lot of fame or infamy. You can see it ran for a very long period of time. And for much of that period of time, it was the world's leading producer of the most important medical isotope, technetium-99m. Mm-hmm. When it started having problems, it caused a world crisis in availability of technetium-99m. I think rather cruelly, the medical community cried foul and said, "You never told us this was going to happen." And I would argue that if anybody had been keeping their eyes on their supply chain, they might have noticed that this reactor was somewhat old, had had problems in the past, and a new problem could occur at any time. But that did then, it was restarted and kept operating until actually very, very recently. And by which time the world was able to pick up the slack and produce the technetium-99m on other reactors. The first demonstration power reactor was the NPD plant, and that was rapidly followed up with a larger scale version of the same machine at Douglas Point. And you can see that those operated for relatively short period of time, but developed the knowledge that was necessary to go on and produce the reactors that are still producing electricity today.
Quick question, whereabouts is Douglas Point? Is it near Toronto or closer to Chalk River?
No, Douglas Point is out on the Bruce Power site.
Okay, thank you.
Bruce Peninsula. So a long way away from population density.
Yes, okay.
The next plant, Pickering, that was built at the time quite a distance from Toronto, but is now basically in the middle of a district of Toronto, as Toronto has expanded out. It's still, six of its units are still operating today, but will be closing in the very near future. So they are coming to the end of their useful life in 2024, I think, is the scheduled date for their closure. They were one of the sets of units that were closed, and you can see if you follow Pickering A, units 1 and 4, they closed and then were restarted sometime later, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Pickering units 2 and 3, they started units 1 and 4 first, and there were some challenges, so they chose not to go ahead with units 2 and 3, so leaving that as a 2-unit station. Pickering B were similar style units, but built a little bit later. They didn't need to be closed, and they're still operating today. The Bruce A units, you can see a gap in their operation. So they were closed for a period of time, and they restarted, and they're operating today. And Bruce B didn't need to be closed. They continue to operate. And Darlington is the newest station that's continuing to operate at the moment. So a fairly substantive fleet within Ontario. There are other power reactors in the province. There's one out in in Canada. There's one out in New Brunswick, a single unit station at Point-le-Pro. That continues to operate today. And there were 2 units, one of which I'm going to talk about in Gentilly. One operated for a significant period of time, but they have choose to close it early. The other one was a challenge, and I'll talk about that in a second. So you'll come to see we have a storied history in nuclear. 60% of Ontario's electricity comes from its nuclear fleet at the moment, and will do for some time to come. The CANDU design has been sold around the world, and I think it's something like maybe 20% of the world's reactors are built to a CANDU design, although a lot of them were built in India to the CANDU design, but adapted by the Indians and not built by Canadians. So the CANDU has been a very successful machine. The route to it has not necessarily always been successful. So we did have a partial meltdown on the NRX experimental reactor. We built a reactor in Quebec, Gentilly 1, that was to a different design, taking some of the CANDU principles, but doing some things to it that people thought would improve the performance, and they didn't. So that only operated intermittently and only over a period of 7 years. The Darlington reactors that are still a very substantive contributor to our electricity today, they were estimated to cost $4 billion to build. They ended up costing $14 billion. But the nuclear industry often takes the blame for that, but a large part of that additional cost was interest payments, and they came about not as a result of technical delays, but as a result of politicians interfering and stopping the project, restarting the project, stopping the project, and restarting the project. And I think there's a lesson there about the commitment that the nuclear industry needs to see from its politicians and its public before it should go ahead with a project, because you cannot afford to stop and start nuclear projects. It just causes too many challenges and increases the costs too much. I talked a little bit about the early closures. Again, there are people that have tried to blame the CANDU technology, but I think that it's fairly obvious that the real challenges were created by interference in the operation that came from management appointees to the organization, who in the first place did not go about maintenance in the appropriate way, and then went into cost savings that I think a lot of people would have recognized were inadvisable. So again, got to be careful with your government and make sure that they understand what they're managing when they're managing nuclear capacity. And then the Pickering A restart, again, the restart was meant to cost 460 million, of Unit 4, 460 million. It ended up costing 1.25 billion. And then Unit 1 was expected to cost 210 million, came 1 billion. But again, you have to understand the circumstances of that. When the first estimate was made, there was an assumption that it would be able to restart to the operating criteria that were required of it when it was first licensed. But the licensing organization, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, said, no, you are starting something that is essentially new. We want it restarted to new standards. So that original estimate was not appropriate to the project that they were actually asked to do. And again, something that you need to be very careful about in understanding the history of nuclear and how nuclear plants need to be operated. Things are going much better now, and the CANDU reactors are halfway through their useful life, or a third of the way through their useful life, if you believe what people are trying to plan for the future, need a refurbishment exercise where some of the core components need to be replaced. It's a major exercise, which I would argue is substantially harder than building a new reactor, because you actually start with a lot of activated components, and therefore you have to deal with it as a nuclear project right from the start, dealing with dose management to your workers, whereas a new build doesn't become active until you deliver the fuel. Those are, we're now involved in a campaign of refurbishment that will be valued at about 24 billion Canadian dollars. So some of the largest infrastructure projects taking place in North America today, and they will see the life extended for the foreseeable future, and they are going very well indeed. So good news stories coming out of those refurbishment projects at the moment, suggesting that from a technical point of view, the nuclear industry is a learning organization, has learned the lessons from the past, and we should have confidence that it could deliver on any nuclear projects in the future.
Could I ask a quick question here, Neil? I would like you to just make a comment at this point on the electricity costs from nuclear power plants compared with Niagara Falls. Now, I know Niagara Falls was built 100 years ago, but it requires maintenance too. And I would guess that nuclear plants take more cost to be maintained. Is that a problem, and how does the public accept that?
Well, you'll know that electricity pricing is a challenge, because it's very complex. Mm-hmm. And because one plant doesn't stand alone. They interact with each other, as we'll come to in a while. So it's very difficult to disaggregate the economics to work out exactly what is going on.
Okay.
But you're right. The comparison with Niagara Falls is if you've got hydro, it's likely to be your most cost-effective and the cleanest electricity that you can produce. And it's also extraordinarily flexible. You and I were talking last night about after the blackout. I was standing on the shores of Lake Ontario watching the lights come back on, and you could see them basically start at Niagara Falls and work their way out from Niagara Falls as the reconnections were made. Very easy restart system. In fact, had I been located much further north, I would have seen the same thing happen from Bruce Power, who had managed to shield themselves from much of the blackout and re-establish operations quite quickly. So there are all those challenges. There are also some manipulations that have gone on with electricity pricing that prevents you from really understanding who's contributing what. But the point I like to make about the costs of electricity is that our ability, the capacity that was created by building the nuclear fleets and having plenty of electricity allowed the province of Ontario to become a manufacturing province. So it enabled the creation of all of those jobs, all of that wealth, all of that contribution to the tax base. So you need to look, if you're looking at electricity, you need to look more broadly than just necessarily the individual cost of the electricity supply at any one moment.
Quick question again, the date of that blackout, was that about 15 years ago? Is that what my memory serves me correctly there?
I think it just celebrated its 20th anniversary.
Okay. Yeah, it's a while back.
Yeah, it was a while. It was a while.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So key point here, things are going well in the Canadian nuclear industry at the moment. Lots of work taking place, lots of experience being generated, and for all of the people that said it's going to be a disaster, it's going to be another cost overrun, it's going to be delayed, that doesn't seem to be happening. So that's really good news for us. Thought it might, I'm not sure how much people know about the CANDO, but I thought I'd just sort of outline a bit of a picture here. And here we've got a couple of sort of representative pictures. One, a pictographic that shows that unlike the pressure water reactors and boiling water reactors, in the CANDO reactors, there are a bunch of pressure tubes. And so the fuel is contained in the pressure tubes and the coolant goes over the pressure tubes. They're moderated by heavy water. Heavy water gives you a much more efficient neutron use. In regular water, actually it moderates neutrons more efficiently than heavy water does, but it actually absorbs them more efficiently as well. Whereas heavy water tends not to absorb so many neutrons, and so it moderates them without absorbing them and makes more of the neutrons that you produce available to run your reactor. Putting them in pressure tubes rather than having them in a single vessel allows you to align the pressure tubes horizontally, and that gives you some advantages as well, and we'll come to that in a second. It also means that you can use fuel bundles that are small, that have a shorter length, because you can push them in and out horizontally. And so our fuel bundles are kind of, well, I guess about 1 meter long, a bit bigger than that. I used to carry one around with me, not an actual fuel bundle. I used to tell people when I showed them that it would be unsafe for me to carry an actual fuel bundle. Because it's natural uranium, it wouldn't be radiologically unsafe for me to do it. They are handled by hand and assembled by hand. That would be perfectly safe, but it would be very heavy. And as an older gentleman, I would like to put my back out if I tried to pick up a real fuel bundle. So there were safety issues associated with it. I stopped carrying it around with me when, after a presentation, I left it in a hotel and realized when I was about an hour away that there was what appeared like a nuclear fuel bundle sitting on a table at a hotel. And I just had visions of being surrounded by police by the time I arrived back at the hotel to surreptitiously take it away again. So I gave up handling it after that, just in case I left it somewhere else inconvenient. On the left-hand side of the slide, there is a picture of the pressure tubes in what we describe as the calandria, showing the whole unit as it is about to be installed into a new reactor. And you can get some feel for the surprise by the fact that there's a gentleman sitting at the bottom of it, and there's another one, I think, sitting there at the top. And I'm hoping he's harnessed in, but at the time that picture was taken, it's possible that he wasn't. So that's a little bit of a background to the CANDO. How does it differ in terms of what it can deliver? So I've laid this out here as the feature of the machine, what effect that has, and then how that creates a benefit for the operator. So it uses heavy water as the moderator and coolant. As I said before, that creates neutron efficiency. The neutron efficiency then allows you to use natural uranium. So you don't need to enrich the uranium, which is a complex process and gives rise to potential for proliferation issues. Using natural uranium, you don't have that problem, and you can handle the fuel by hand, as I said before, and it reduces the cost of the fuel. So that's one of the benefits. Secondary benefit, and it hasn't been used for this yet, but it has been investigated, is that it means you can use the machine to use other fuels, use the machine with other fuels. So you can rejig the CANDO design to use thorium as a fuel, and you can rejig it to use actually the used fuel from pressurized water reactors, and without reprocessing, to use that to get further burn up in a CANDO. Pressure tubes. As far as Canada is concerned, one of the great advantages of that was that everything could be made in Canada. So coming out of the Second World War, which is when much of this was being planned, Canada had a domestic industry of certain capability, and it wouldn't have had the ability to build large pressure vessels. So building fuel pressure tubes instead was something that the Canadian nuclear industry could do. And it means that rather than having one vessel, you've got lots of channels, which means that things happen kind of slowly, because if something goes wrong on one of the channels, it doesn't have a very large effect on the overall machine. And it gives a kind of buffer for all of the operations. That operators like that, because it means things tend to happen slowly or slower than in a large machine, giving you more capacity to deal with an issue should it arise. And the fact that you can put the tubes horizontally means that you can go for online fueling, which means that you don't have to shut your machine down to refuel. You can just post in new fuel while the machine is still in full operation, and that keeps your capacity factors up. But it also allows people that are not experienced with reactors to run them for long periods of time without undertaking the necessary maintenance. So it enabled the mismanagement that took place that led to their closure. It has some disbenefits. So can't remember why I put costly there. That was a mistake. But it does produce, having heavy water close to where the neutrons are being produced does give rise to the production of large quantities of tritium. And then that tritium needs to be processed when it starts to create a dose for workers. So you have another processing route. It does actually then allow you to sell tritium because it's quite a useful product for many other purposes. So there's a sort of a subsidiary upside that comes from the downside of tritium production. The pressure tube issue, you've got lots of them, so that gives you a buffer, but it also means you've got a complex machine with lots and lots of pumps and valves and control systems. And the pressure tubes are made of zirconium, and that tends to absorb the hydrogen, and that causes them to embrittle. And that's what leads to the refurbishment that needs to take place halfway through the useful life. And the ability to online refuel gives you a lot of flexibility in getting the capacity factors up, keeping the machines operating. But then the fueling machines are quite complex and they tend to fail, and the operators don't like that because that's a nuisance that they've got to deal with. So some upsides and some downsides to the CANDU reactor. This is to give you a bit of a picture for, how long am I talking for, Richard?
Well, we generally wrap things up after around an hour, but we don't have a rigid time on that. We have a total of 2 hours.
I might rattle through this a little bit quicker then.
Probably could, yeah. I just love this slide though.
Okay, yeah, this is 2020 figures on the actual outputs of electricity. So this is how much electricity was actually used by the good people of Ontario. In 2020, 60% of it came from the nuclear plant. So a large majority of it. 25% of it came from hydro, a large quantity of that coming from Niagara Falls. And the big difference between nuclear as you project forward and hydro is that we've pretty much maxed out the hydro capacity, but you can build as many nuclear power stations as you want, and there's enough fuel to keep us going for as long as we might possibly imagine. So there's a big difference in the expansion.
You said as long as one could imagine. Can you imagine CANDU plants lasting beyond 80 years to 100 or more?
So the existing ones are having their lives extended at the moment with the changes to the pressure tubes. That will push them out. People are looking at whether they could be extended again, but the jury is out on that at the moment as to whether that will make sense to do that.
Okay, thank you.
They have bought us quite a lot of time of clean electricity. Ontario is one of the world's cleanest large grids. So, people will talk about some other jurisdictions that are doing it with renewable capacity. But if you look around for where successful large grids are operating, they tend to all have nuclear as their base. If they don't have geothermal or hydro, it will be nuclear that they're relying on.
Thank you.
In terms of the actual outputs, 7% of it was gas and 8% of it was wind. And those other two little slivers are solar and biofuels. But they were so small that I couldn't even get the titles onto the wedge that they created. I talk to people about the practicality of expanding and the number of times compared with the existing base that you would need to do things in order to achieve your objectives. You could expand capacity quite easily by expanding nuclear. It would make a lot of difference to your installed wind capacity to do it using wind. Some of the challenges that people need to bear in mind. In terms of the installed capacity, and this is what I think Richard likes, although 60% of the electricity is produced by nuclear, it's only 34% of the installed capacity. So it's doing the heavy lifting with significant capacity factors. Hydro kind of keeps operating all the time and produces about the same as it does as the installed capacity. Gas has a large installed capacity and a low delivery, not because of its capacity factors, but because it is there for dealing with peaks. So it's only turned on when it's really needed. Wind, on the other hand, is 13% of the installed capacity, only produces 8% of the electricity, despite the fact that it is a baseload generator. And I have large arguments with people about this because when electricity was first being built, everything was reliable. You could turn it on when you wanted it. And so we started referring to electricity generation capacity as baseload, stuff that you designed and built to operate all the time to meet the electricity demand that always existed, and peakers, which were typically lower capital cost, higher operating cost plants that you put in place just to run occasionally when you needed it. And then we started introducing intermittent electricity, which turned on and off. And people started putting that into the peaker capacity. But it isn't peaker capacity because it's always on when it's available. So it's actually meeting baseload needs. And the reason I make that point is people played that trick to imply that it had a higher value when actually it has a lower value. So it's unreliable baseload rather than peak capacity. And you can see that in this slide here that shows that it doesn't deliver on its installed promise, which is not surprising. The wind doesn't always blow. I did a quick one with the refurbishments taking place, and so nuclear capacity down at the moment. When I was making these slides, so you can see I lied slightly about when I put. Oh, it says November the 4th. I'm not predicting forward. That should have said October the 4th. So I did do some of the slides a little bit earlier than last night. You can go on to the Independent Electricity System Operators website, and you can see at any moment how much of the electricity is coming from what other plant. So I just sat there at my computer and I made this slide based on how much electricity was being produced at 4:30 on October the 4th. And you can see nuclear is at 54%, it's down because we got some plants in refurbishment. Hydro is 26%. We had pretty much all of our gas running because wind and solar were making no contribution whatsoever. And that is one of the challenges of systems built on intermittent renewable capacity. Biomass wasn't 0%, but it comes out as 0% because my computer couldn't calculate to the number of zeros below that it existed.
Yeah.
Now I mention all of that because, and I used to have a slide of this. I had to actually run a video and capture a copy of the slide because I've lost the slide. But I used to talk about people's perception of electricity generation based upon what they read about in the press. So this was from a presentation of about 10 years ago that just said, if you went to a newspaper and saw what was written about electricity production, you would see that 95% of it was about wind and solar, and 5% or so was about natural gas, and maybe, well, even less about nuclear. And the problem with that is that it gives people perceptions. So most people in Ontario, when they are asked about nuclear power, are blissfully ignorant of the fact that 60% of their electricity has come from nuclear power for pretty much as long as they can remember. And a large proportion of them will think that a lot of their electricity is generated by wind and solar because that's all they ever learn about. It's all they ever read about. And this poll was done, again, I had to steal the slide from a video presentation. A poll was done to see what people did understand about electricity. And they found that 76% of Ontarians were unclear about where their electricity came from. And only 24% of them knew that nuclear power was the major source of electricity production. So the point I make to people is if electricity generation was a democracy and we voted for it, then we would never make the right decisions. And the reason I make that point is the public are interfering in electricity generation decisions because they are telling governments what they will and won't vote in. based on their understanding of electricity generation, and they are nearly always wrong. And that's a challenge to the planet as we move forward and try and plan how we're going to create energy for the future, because it is being done on the basis of misunderstandings, and that is going to be drive bad decision making. So I haven't yet started on the actual subject, and we are most of the way through the presentation.
Right.
And to answer Richard's presentation, Richard's question about, what are we going to do in the future? I actually went around and said, okay, what are the plans? And basically, there are no plans. So everybody is trying to avoid addressing the issue because they really don't have anything that's acceptable. But one of the companies involved, SNC-Lavalin, who actually now own the rights to the CANDO technology when the industry was, as a result of the privatization of the industry. So they are essentially CANDO nerds. They had recently produced a study for the government suggesting a way forward in Ontario, and in fact, a model for the rest of the country. And not surprisingly, it involves building CANDOs. And so the thesis of this presentation is that historically, we solved all the problems by building CANDOs. There's nothing wrong with CANDO. The solution for the future would be to build more of them. It's not a huge logical step, and yet it seems to be one that the governments have failed to so far make. And this is SNC-Lavalin's presentation that says, come on guys, why don't we do the obvious? So one of the big issues is when you saw those pies earlier on, they were of the existing demands for electricity. But if we want to get to net zero, and the world has decided we want to get to net zero, then the most obvious route to it is increased electrification. So electric vehicles, electric heating, electric processes in industry. Because you can produce electricity a number of different ways. It's not the energy source, it is simply a way of conveying from whatever energy source you have to a way of using it. And that means we can, unless anybody has got other bright ideas, and people are looking at hydrogen, but even if you're going for hydrogen, it looks like you need more electricity to do it. Everything seems to come back to electricity production. And it's a fairly simple model. If you want to go to net zero, you need more electricity. Now, that's what people are struggling to get their heads around at the moment. It's not just our current electricity systems we need to clean up, it is the electricity that we need for the future as well. And that dramatically increases the amount of electricity you need. That's just making that point and saying, where it comes from. In fact, electricity in Ontario is clean at the moment. So in order to clean up Ontario, we need to focus on the other issues, transport, heavy industry, building heat, things like that. And yet, and this is one of the things that's going wrong as we try and deal with greenhouse gases, almost everybody is focused on trying to play with the current electricity system, which is largely an irrelevance. That's just making the point that we need to go forward. This is to try and present to people the idea that on the left-hand side is our existing electricity system and how it's built up. On the right-hand side is what it increases in size by if you want to electrify all of those other systems. So it's a dramatic increase in size. And the reason that it's an important point to make is that some of the things that you have in the left-hand ring cannot increase when you go to the right-hand ring. So hydro is already maxed out. You can't do it with hydro, which leaves you dealing with the other issues, the other things that you can build. And there is restrictions on the rate at which you can build things. So in order to build a picture of what your future electrified system might look like, you have to be realistic about what you can actually achieve. So if you've heard the argument, we need all of everything. They're not joking, right? So it's no good saying, I'd like to do this, or I'd like to do that, or I don't really like the other. If you want to electrify and you want to get to a net zero system, you need to look at everything that you have and not be picky and choosing about it.
Could I raise a point here, Neil?
Yeah.
For the group, on your left side, you have 62% hydro. Now, that's not the number that you were using for Ontario. And I want to make it clear to everyone that Quebec must be very close to 100% hydro, and British Columbia has a fairly high percentage of it as well. And that's why you see the Canadian number there, 62% hydro. Just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, sorry, everybody. I had flipped to the early part of the presentation was about Ontario. The SNC Lavalin presentation is about Canada in general. And you are right, Richard. Quebec is largely hydro, and Manitoba is largely hydro, and British Columbia has a significant quantity of hydro.
Good. Okay.
But in all those cases, hydro is the first place you turn to, and therefore they are all largely maxed out. So there are things that can be done, but there's still not much opportunity to expand. And interestingly, hydro is increasingly unpopular as well. So we have a number of hydro projects that are being held up by environmental protesters because of the damage that hydro does to the environment. So
unfortunately, the rest of Canada doesn't have these beautiful Niagara Falls where you have the run of the river, because particularly in Quebec, I think there was quite a bit of resistance to damming up all those beautiful wetlands.
It yeah, and it does change. It changes the environment quite dramatically. Yes. So Niagara Falls is just a perfect sort of hydro generation capacity. A huge amount of water banked up behind it. A huge amount of a large lake into which the water gets ditched, and so you can extract energy out of that without making any difference to the environment whatsoever. And so far as I'm aware, no salmon have ever jumped up Niagara Falls. So so it's not.
But you know, the salmon's enemy came up the Welland Canal, the sea lamprey.
Indeed, yeah, mankind has the ability to transfer things around.
Right.
So, so this is saying, you know, that nuclear can do an expansion of nuclear can do a lot in the heavy lifting as we try and electrify Canada, and this is a way forward that people need to pay attention to. And because I'm running out of time, I'm not going into the detail, but that's just a detailed map of how they could do it, and using existing CANDU design or small developments on the existing CANDU design that we would know how to operate, we would know how to build. Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power have demonstrated that they know how to take on modern large infrastructure nuclear build projects. So as a sensible way forward, it makes a lot of sense. And this is just showing how all the things we've talked about, that they could use CANDUs to help in that transition. So a lot of people are talking about using hydrogen as a fuel source. So you can use CANDUs to make hydrogen if you need that for applications that you can't electrify. Some of the transport applications. A large part of our greenhouse gas production is burning natural gas to get oil out of the oil sands. That could very easily be replaced with a nuclear reactor. A very efficient way, bizarrely, because it ends up in producing a fossil fuel, but because a lot of fossil fuel is being used to produce that fossil fuel, you could reduce emissions very quickly by cleaning up the way that the oil is produced. They can also be used to reuse spent fuel, and we use them to produce medical and industrial isotopes, increasingly so. So making a case for CANDUs as a as an opportunity for something more than just clean electricity production, but solving other challenges, national challenges as well. So that's the can-do option. Something that's happening in, I should say that they launched that. It attracted absolutely no attention whatsoever, and nobody is discussing it, but we are still talking about how many windmills that we should build. So it's a bizarre dislocation between the facts of electricity generation and what people are prepared to do. And it's an issue that has to be resolved. People have to start understanding what the real issues are if we are going to make any progress. Simultaneously, and I'm going to be a little critical of this, I should say before I'm critical of this, I believe I have a right to be, because I was one of the first proponents of SMRs in Canada, and I still stick to what I said about them. I was routinely told by the nuclear industry to shut up about SMRs, small modular reactors, so much smaller nuclear reactors than were built in the past, to advanced designs that have learned what we've learned over the last 50 years about nuclear technology, use new materials, use new manufacturing techniques to deliver very different machines that you could quite happily have in your neighborhood or even as your neighbor, and feel safe and meet demands.
Quick question.
Yeah.
And there are already a couple of questions shorting up, and we'll get to those in a minute, but I'm going to ask you, while you're talking about SMRs, are you talking about the new scale variety, which is now being tested in Idaho? And if so, as opposed to some form of can-do that could be miniaturized, and what strength of enrichment is being used? Are they approaching 20% enrichment or 10%? Just curious to know what your thoughts are about SMRs in Canada.
Right. So you asked some very good questions there that I think are answered a bit as I go through this.
Okay. Okay.
But in terms of the enrichment, all SMRs that are currently being proposed at the moment require enriched fuel, and this is simply a matter of their geometry. As you shrink things down, you are losing more neutrons from the system, and therefore you don't have them to keep the reaction going. So that pretty much forces you in every design to have an enriched fuel. Many of them use the maximum amount of enrichment that you are allowed before you get into proliferation issues. So 20% is a kind of cutoff point. Yeah. And a lot of them are designed to use 20%. One of them that I'm going to, is part of the program here in Canada, uses enrichment at about 5%. And some, as you'll see later, use a variety of different types of fuel that involve reprocessing. So I'll come to all of that.
Good.
So I was heavily involved in kicking it off. I was routinely told to shut up because it was never going to happen. And then people realized it was going to happen and got excited about it. And there is now a feeding frenzy. And it's a feeding frenzy that distracts from the fact that we also need full-sized reactors. Small modular reactors can be cost-effective, but they are cost-effective in places where you can't put a large reactor. If you can put a large reactor, that is going to be more efficient simply in terms of its size and its ability to produce electricity. So, we need to do both what SNC were proposing for large reactors and this, not one or the other. But people have got excited and emotional about small modular reactors, and so all the focus is going there at the moment, and that's distracting from the bigger picture, which is unhelpful. And it speaks to the nuclear industry making some of the mistakes that were made in the other power generation industries that we've talked about. We've got as far as the government leading an exercise to develop a roadmap. And then that roadmap led into an action plan, which was again sponsored by the government. And we are diligently working towards a program. There are officially 3 streams to the program. The first is an early grid machine. So this would be to try and bring new nuclear capacity on as soon as possible. And that would use Darlington. So there is space where the existing Darlington station exists to build new reactors. And it's in fact licensed for new reactors. And the declared intention is that we will have one operating there by 2028. And they have run a selection process and have pre-selected 3 reactor designs, and they are about to, well, they have said that by the end of this year, they will narrow that down to 1, and then they will pursue that. The 3 designs are X-Energy, that's an American company working on a triso-fueled high-temperature gas-cooled reactor. So triso-fuel are small pellets of the fuel contained in a silicon carbide ball, and the great advantage of doing that is that the containment of the silicon carbide is such that there is no point at which the containment will break down, no temperature at which the containment will break down that the ball can actually get to. So it gets to a point where it's emitting heat faster than the pellet could ever generate heat, and it's still at a lower temperature than would cause the silicon carbide to break down. So all of those issues of a meltdown are removed because it couldn't get to a temperature where the meltdown would occur. So that's the principle of the triso-fuel reactor. Hitachi have a 300 megawatt boiling water reactor that uses all of their experience in larger boiling water reactors, brews it down to create a much simpler and cheaper to build machine. And they're proposing that one, and they're moving forward on that. And then Terrestrial Energy are a Canadian-based company working on a molten salt reactor where the fuel is actually dissolved in the molten salt. The molten salt circulates, so the first coolant is the salt itself. So that has huge efficiencies in terms of the temperatures that you can operate at, and some great advantages in terms of not allowing, because it's a molten salt, you're not allowing gas buildups and the challenges that are created by them. So Terrestrial Energy are moving forward with that. They started out as a small modular reactor with a design below 300 megawatts. They're also now working on what would still be a modular reactor, but would not be categorized as small because it's in the 400 megawatt range. So it would be a small end of a full-scale reactor. So that's the first stream with an intention to build something by 2028. In parallel, out in New Brunswick, they are looking at waste burning technologies. So these would be advanced reactors that would actually allow you to consume existing stocks of used fuel, or to take the used fuel out of the reactor, reprocess it, and continue to use it so that you get increased burn up, more efficiency of fuel use, and much less of a challenge in dealing with used fuel at the end of the fuel's useful life. So that will take longer to progress those technologies. And New Brunswick is looking at 2 of them. One is the Arc Energy Reactor, which is a sodium-cooled fast reactor. And they're originally an American company that have a Canadian company to pursue the Canadian opportunity. And then Moltex Energy came out of the United Kingdom, and they also now have a Canadian company to pursue the Canadian interests. They are using a molten salt reactor, but the molten salt is contained within fuel pins inside a molten salt coolant. So it has the advantages of both of knowing where your fuel is at any one time, because it's contained within the pin, whilst also having the meltdown resistance of a molten salt coolant. And that, because of the efficient neutron use of the molten salt, allows you to also use used fuel as the original fuel for the cleanup. Both of those use a reprocessing technique that is not similar to reprocessing that's gone on in the past, where the fuel has to be dissolved using quite nasty chemicals and produces large volumes that are then difficult to manage. These would use thermoelectric techniques where you just melt the fuel so the volume doesn't change. You're not dissolving it in anything. It can't really escape, because if it escapes from the heat, it freezes again instantaneously. And then you use an electrochemical technique to do the reprocessing. Another advantage of that is you can, both of them use fuels where you do not need to reprocess to the same degree of finesse as you would, as we have done in the past, and therefore you can't use the products for weapons manufacture. So it significantly removes the proliferation challenge. People will come back and debate that one with me. I'm not technically adept to answer that, but the argument is that we don't have a prevention, and we don't have a proliferation challenge. And then the third stream is what we call micro-modular reactors. So these are very, very small units in the kind of 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt range. They would be used to run a small campus, a small industry, maybe in multiple units to run a mine site. And 2 reactors being looked at: the Westinghouse Davinci reactor, which is a solid block in which the fuel is encased. The solid block distributes the heat to heat pipes. The heat pipes remove the energy from the whole solid block, and then the heat from the heat pipes is extracted to run a turbine and produce electricity. And then and Bruce Power are looking at that as a commercial opportunity. And then there is another design developed by an American company, USNC, and being proposed by a Canadian company, Global First Power, that is now backed by OPG. And they are using a small triso-fueled high temperature gas-cooled reactor, but much, much smaller than the X-Energy one, with an objective to demonstrate that at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. Again, it's on an existing licensed site where there is a considerable degree of public acceptance. And I think, yeah, so that's where I get to. That sort of says where we are with the program. I think I made my key comments on that, but we don't need one or the other in terms of large reactors or small reactors. We need a program that progresses both of them. I forgot to make my slide about the challenges. So Richard and I were having a discussion about where I see some of the difficulties. My big issue about the small modular reactor program is we are entirely focused at the moment on the technology, because nuclear industry people like dealing with technology, and I spoke there about the technology. What we are not paying enough attention is to the deployment opportunities. So I have a mantra that says you can perfect the perfect seed, but if you plant it in a desert, it's not going to grow. But actually, if you make the ground fertile, you'll end up with a forest, whether you plant anything or not. And so there are issues around making it possible to deploy reactors in Canada that we are not currently dealing with. One of the biggest ones being public perception. And one of the reasons that public perception is important, going back to my comments earlier in the presentation, is if you have a government that likes nuclear, but it's not backed by by the public, you have support for your nuclear program while that government is in power. But nuclear power programs last longer than a single government. So if the government changes and the new government doesn't have that support from the public, they will stop the project. And we will end up with a Darlington situation where it stops, starts, gets debated. My argument is if you're going to go ahead with a nuclear program, you need solid support. And if you're going to have solid support, you need the public to support it, because the public will support it regardless of the color of the politicians that are in power at any one moment. And it means that you have the solid support that you need to run your nuclear program. And unfortunately, in Canada, we are putting almost no effort into that whatsoever, spending all the money on technology development, and we run the risk of having the same outcome that we've had in the past. And it's something that I'm lobbying very hard to get changed in order that we might have a successful program. So I think that's my comments. I've talked for an hour and 10. So I hope it was interesting.
Fascinating, thoroughly enjoyable. Neil, I'm so grateful. I would just ask, first of all, that if you go back to your, another slide, like that one or the first one or anyone.
I realized the
flashing thing was getting just a little annoying. I would like to follow up on your very last remarks and make it to our entire class that, as well as to you, that this has been recorded. It will be reachable probably in a few days. They're pretty swift about it at the site called platomadison.org. And the most recent ones from our group, Pathways to a Sustainable Planet, are at the top. And it's usually not hard to find the most recent talk at that site. It's a YouTube, and you can click on that YouTube and send it to any of your friends and family who you think might like to watch this recording. And that way we can contribute to this enriched soil, and let's call it enriched and perhaps a bit educated, more so than the general public, to promote the kind of enthusiasm in which the seeds of nuclear power can be transmitted to the politicians, and with educating them. So I think you've started the ball rolling, Neil, and we look forward to your comments about the media in other issues like that in 2 weeks. I have a bunch of questions always on this, but before I get to them, I'd like to give one of our members, Michael, a chance to ask his. He asks, what is the Canadian perspective on the future contribution of nuclear fusion to the mix of electrical power generation? What do you say, Neil?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And in fact, one of the things I did in my previous job was initiate a program to try and get fusion research restarted in Canada. There is some, but there is no consolidated program. And it was with a deliberate attempt to, whilst not being specific to a technology, to make sure that Canada would be a good place for one of our own companies, General Fusion, who are based in Vancouver and are developing a fusion device, to make it a good place for them to stay. And unfortunately, that program didn't go ahead. I was unable to put the effort behind it that it really needed. And General Fusion, while still being a Canadian company, will be building their next machine, their next research machine in the United Kingdom, which I consider.
What about Canada's? I presume that Canada is a contributor to at least the money, and possibly more than money, perhaps some technical support at the ITER project in southern France. Is that not true?
So no. Canada actually bid to have the ITER project located in Ontario, and was unable to. So a lot of effort was put into that, and we withdrew from the program. And shortly after that, despite looking to try and host it, the government decided not to invest in being an ITER contributor. And so Canada is not involved directly in the ITER program. Increasingly, discussions are taking place because ITER will consume large quantities of tritium.
Yes.
And almost all the world's tritium is held in, almost all the world's contained and accessible tritium, because of course there's lots of tritium all over the world, but the contained and available tritium is currently in Canada. So there are lots of discussions taking place as to how Canada can be seen as a contributor and become more involved in the ITER program. I think going back to the original question, it is unclear as to what the views are. The Canadian government did put some investment into general fusion, but not a great deal. It does not have a consolidated program. The regulator is at present looking at its regulations to ensure that it could regulate a fusion program should one develop. But the issue is not much discussed. And as we say, I personally am mourning the loss of general fusion to another country. It's a tragedy for Canada, not necessarily because anybody who knows anything about fusion technologies, there are lots of different approaches at the moment. I'm not necessarily saying general fusions would be the successful one, but having the knowledge would enable the country to move forward quickly with whichever route fusion does go. Having a lack of knowledge is a deficiency for the country, and I wish we could correct that.
Well, thank you for that answer. I think it's as good as we can get for Canada. I did not know before that Canada had backed out and the backing at the basis for that, but I hope that that could be rethought, especially with the availability of tritium in Canada. That's a good plus.
Canadian companies will be increasingly involved in the ITER program because of that tritium issue. So,
yeah, we have had another guest who may be with us today. I don't see his name, Dr. Bulent Attalay, who's spoken to our group twice about fusion and is quite interested in it. And he has not yet put his money down, if he were a gambling man, on whether ITER would succeed over some of the smaller projects that are being developed, I think, on both coasts of this country, I think at MIT and on the West Coast as well. And so I think it's a difficult, questionable gamble to try and make. And but I think the world is waiting with considerable interest, because Dr. Attalay did show us quite clearly that fusion would have some significant benefits over fission. It's considerably more energy dense, not a vast amount, but more dense, and that the waste products, there are some, mostly any residual tritium and other products that might need to be cared for and contained, might be left over, but you don't have all of the fission products that fission has. And so Dr. Attalay has made that quite clear, and the whole world, I think, is excited about the possibility of fusion. And that I think the part of the problem is it does seem to be far enough away, and we need to get moving a little faster, a lot faster than we have been for the last 10 years or 20 years on reducing our carbon emissions. So it's always a little off in the future, but thank you for that answer.
I thought you were going to say we need to move much faster on our fusion programs. And one of the things I find quite exciting about it is that the ITER program is really important because it's generating information.
Yes.
And absolutely essential information. So it's really important, but it is a huge, huge machine.
Yes.
That means that the rate of progress is restricted, because any change takes a lot of effort to make the change. But there are now a whole group of commercial companies looking at much, much smaller machines.
Yes.
So they can innovate at a speed that is orders of magnitude faster than ITER. Now, that is not to detract from ITER, because as I said, you need that solid route forward that is going to make progress. But then at the side, there are all these other people with different ideas that are, feeding off ITER that can move much quicker. And And so that's where I think, we've got to do both, but there's some real excitement in terms of the rate of acceleration. And the other point that I would make, recognizing that fusion has some real challenges, right? So I'm not suggesting this is going to happen instantly, but if it does happen, if we do make breakthroughs, there is always a problem building fission reactors because of all of the measures that need to be put in place, the environmental assessments, the dealing with the public, the process that's needed is slow. So it will take time to build out fission reactors, even if they dramatically improve the design. Fusion reactors, you could just license them to anyone and anyone could build them. So you could be building hundreds, thousands at any one moment if they can make the breakthrough and develop that kind of business model. So the ability to deal with the challenges could change very dramatically if that breakthrough takes place.
Thank you for that. That's a very interesting perspective. So we need to develop both aspects toward fusion, just as we need for fission to keep the existing ones going, as well as promote some of the newer advanced technologies. So thank you for that point of view. I don't see any other questions coming up, which surprises me. We usually have an active questions. You can click on chat on your screen and type in a question. I know one of our listeners says that he has a hard time typing in questions, but there is a bit of time ahead of us now. It's 11:25. We still have a bit of time if he or anybody else would like to type in a question. I'm right here ready to read them off to Neil. While we're waiting for those, Neil, would you like to make any comments about, well, one I would like you to discuss is the tar sands in Alberta and on the edge of the Northwest Territories there, or the Yukon perhaps. As I understand it, there are some huge investments in the tar sands by not only Canadian, but many American politicians with money, as well as people outside the political environment. And my question is, if we've got very successful, it's a big F, in promoting nuclear reactors around the world, and particularly in Canada, if Canada got very successful, you would obviously need to have some input of oil coming in for various aspects of manufacturing, lubrication, pharmaceuticals, etc. So you'd need to keep some oil coming, but my question to you is, would you need to keep the tar sands open for that? Is there not sufficient oil elsewhere in Canada to provide that oil? And would it be a terrible economic deprivation for Canada to shut the tar sands? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and be, this is some very contentious issues. So I'm going to try and go back to first principles a bit to justify my arguments. But so firstly, one of the things I think people have failed to realize, mainly because we've really never had to deal with this issue before, but greenhouse gases are a global issue. So what anybody does in one particular area, it affects the entire world. So we historically have been used to dealing with pollution, where you can see the source of the pollution, and therefore you can move in and deal. You know whose fault it is. You can deal with. Greenhouse gases, it's everybody's problem. And what you don't want to be doing is moving the problem around the world and actually making the world situation worse, which has been the tendency. And if you look at COP26, they will still be talking about national programs And the problems with national programs is that if they're not carefully thought through, they just move the problem into another country. And that doesn't actually solve the problem. So the first thing we need to do is start thinking internationally about the problem and creating international solutions. And that kind of speaks to the situation with the oil sands. So, you know, a lot of people say, oh, they're evil, we should shut them down. If we shut down the oil sands, oil will come from somewhere else in the world because it's driven by demand. And, you know, we're seeing this interesting situation at the moment where demand is outstripping supply, so price is going up and everybody's complaining about it, right? And governments are now working to try and resolve the problem. So they're simultaneously trying to shut down oil and increase oil because they're not getting a grip on the real issues. So if you want to stop oil use, you have to find alternatives to the way it is used, because we're not going to go back to living in clay caves. So that gets back to my point about electricity usage. We shouldn't be focusing on trying to close the oil sands because that's not going to achieve anything. We should be focusing on trying to electrify things so that the oil from the oil sands ceases, or the demand for it is reduced.
May I interrupt for just a moment? I think you may have misinterpreted my question. I'm not trying to pick on the Athabasca tar sands specifically. My question was not to burn or combust any oil. Let's say that we achieve with nuclear the lack of a need for any further fossil fuel. Let's imagine that theoretical possibility, difficult as that will be. My question to you is, can Canada as a country find enough oil without having to sidetrack and build another nuclear reactor to provide heat for the darn place? And the oil comes very nicely out of the ground, I believe, in other parts of Canada besides the Athabasca tar sands. Why can't that just be pumped up? Would it provide enough oil for Canada, is my question, without having to provide nuclear power to warm up the stuff in the Athabasca tar sands?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, and I think nobody does, because there's so many variables in it. So
you're a very careful fellow, Neil. I respect that, but it's
assumptions you make. But going back to your last point, you know, one of the, so if you start with my principle that the world is going to demand oil, and our focus should be on looking at ways that we can demand less, rather than on trying to turn the taps off. Because actually, if you turn the taps off, you end up with wars and suffering and all sorts of challenges. But look at the demand side. But one of the demand sides is producing the oil itself. So one of the things you can do very quickly, which is like, you know, the point I was making earlier, is if you stop burning fossil fuels to make the oil, then the oil produces, at the end of the day, contributes much less to the greenhouse gases. And that's an action that Canada could take that would reduce our emissions quite quickly without causing any other knock-on consequences.
Good
so
point.
It's something worth looking at. And then increasingly, so where I was leading to with my prior discussion, one of the things I feel quite strongly about is we've got to stop vilifying the oil companies. All we have done is do what we ask of them, right? We wanted oil, we demanded oil. If we ever find a situation where the oil supply is restricted, we scream and shout at them. So vilifying them for doing exactly what we asked them to do is not particularly helpful.
I agree with you completely. And in fact, that leads to my amusement when I see people demonstrating at pipelines. They're going to continue making pipelines as long as we keep going to gas stations. And what we do need to do is clean up the grid so that in Wisconsin, for example, some of us have electric vehicles. And I don't think we're any more efficient, if as efficient, as having a hybrid car, which costs considerably less. So we really need to clean up our grid is at least 80% gas and coal here in Wisconsin. We don't have anything like what you enjoy in Ontario. And so there's not much motivation to drive electrically or fly electrically or anything else when our grid is so dirty here. And
I used to live in Saskatchewan, where almost all the electricity is produced by coal.
yeah,
And there was somebody driving an electric car around Saskatchewan, and I'm like, coal-fired car, right? It just,
right.
Not necessarily helpful, but I'm sure they thought that they were doing the world a favor, where it's possible they were, but it's likely that they weren't. My other point about the oil companies is they're not just oil companies, they're energy companies, and they actually have the heft to solve the problems. So instead of pushing them out of the tent, we need to bring them in and say, you're the people that are going to help us solve these problems. Let's work together, rather than declare war on them and make them entrench their position, rather than bring them to help us solve the problems.
You may well be right. I worry, though, that the oil companies are working through the green organizations to spend a lot of money and time and effort persuading the public that nuclear is bad, because they're really much more terrified of nuclear energy than they are of wind and solar, which they know by itself will not do the job, and we will always be dependent on oil. So I worry that the oil companies might be behind the intransigent resistance of most green organizations to support nuclear at all, and they keep harping 100% renewables.
So that speaks to my let's make the ground fertile, and bring the energy companies into the SMR picture, and talk about business models where they might sell the electricity instead of selling oil, and then they're still supplying as much energy as they ever used to supply, and they have a sustainable future. Realistically, governments don't have the money to solve the greenhouse gas problem. They need industry to come in and do it. Let's find ways to make that easy for them. Good
point. By the way, have you ever read Climate Gamble by Palonen and Partanen and Konen in Finland?
I'm afraid I have not, no.
Well, there's a simple solution. You can go on this very organization that's recording your talk and go back a couple of weeks to, actually it was the last Monday in September, and I reviewed their book, and especially you might find it somewhat amusing to see their introduction, which praises Ontario for its wonderful advancement of nuclear energy. And so I think you would enjoy that book. And I have a picture from their introduction on that YouTube talk. So I invite you to go have a look at it.
I will try and do that.
If you have any difficulty, let me know. I can send you the YouTube.
I find it, hugely ironic that Germany managed to come here and sell us their plan that we then exploited, and where their greenhouse gas emissions actually went in the wrong direction.
Yes.
We could have.
And the cost of their electricity is twice that of France. And they import quite a bit of electricity from France into Western Germany. And there's a website that they talk about, I think it's called energymap.com or something like that. And you can see at any point in time anywhere around the world, but particularly it's interesting to go to Europe and see exactly how much energy is coming from France going into neighboring countries, Spain, Italy, Germany, and England, because of the availability of plentiful nuclear clean electricity in France.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting makeup, and I struggle with the fact that the way humans respond is still to kind of emotionally impose rules rather than rationally sit down. And anybody that did would say, okay, well, let's look at where reduction in emissions has worked. and then use that as a model to move forward. And yet actually what we're intending to do is look at where it hasn't worked and use that as a model, because it's a model we would like to work.
So, lacking any other questions that I'm seeing from my group, which surprises me, let me ask a question about these three streams that you have on this slide. I'm particularly pleased with terrestrial energy, and I guess it's Moltex. For both of them have, I really like the technology of molten salt reactors. But yeah, I'm concerned. I think X Energy and another company, it might be, it's not Davinci, but it's another one there, that has these ceramic pebbles. Mm-hmm. And I have a problem with ceramic pebbles. Maybe you can comment on it. First of all, they were developed originally here at the University of Wisconsin, and the idea was exported to Oak Ridge and worked on for a while there. I'm forgetting the name of the guy who pursued it, but Germany picked up on it, and they built two pebble bed reactors, both of which overheated and caused significant problems in cleaning them up. In fact, I think neither one of them had been thoroughly cleaned up yet, to the best of my knowledge. And some of them were just encased in some concrete and said, well, we'll get back to it later. But it was very difficult to manage them. And the Germans may have gotten some of their negativism about nuclear energy from those, as well as some other political historical factors related to Hitler. But it worries me that history in Germany is not at all good. And it also concerns me that it would be rather difficult to recycle the uranium out of those pellets without exposing the public workers unnecessarily and without having a lot of mixed chemicals. What are your thoughts about the pebble bed reactor in general?
So going back to my initial comments about not being technically qualified. So these are the non-technically qualified ones. And also not wishing to imply that any one of the reactors is better than any other. In fact, let me make the point that I think all of the reactors that are in front of us would be easy to license and would operate safely and efficiently. And I have no concerns about any of them.
Okay.
Sorry, post the regulator taking their view on you, I have no concerns.
Well, I think that's good. I'm only verbalizing my concerns to you, and I don't want them taken too literally.
Recognizing that they all have challenges, right? Yeah. And they all have opportunities. Yes, the triso fuel that was used in Germany, they didn't produce to a high enough quality. They had leakage. So although the silicon carbide didn't break down, there were cracks in it when it was manufactured, and things can escape from that. So those challenges all have to be dealt with. The observation that I would make is that we now have decades more experience in doing things. And we have new materials, and we have an increased understanding. One of the points I make to a lot of people about the nuclear industry is when the first reactors were built, we had only understood the principles of nuclear energy for less than a decade. And we had no one that had previously built a nuclear reactor. And we had very little experience in modeling and operating and modeling their behavior. Now we're designing reactors with supercomputers, complex codes based on 50 years of science, using materials that we never had access to previously, and and the work being done by people that have benefited from being taught by the people that understood the first principles. So, everything we do is going to be that much better. And that's great news for the technology that's going into these reactors. I come back to the fact that why are we spending so much money on technology development when we know the technologies are going to work, and so little on the things that we don't understand, like how do we convince the public that this is the right way to go and get their support for what we're doing. And I routinely think it's just that because it's easy to spend money on technology, we know how to do it, but the public are difficult and we don't know how to deal with it, so we'll pretend that they don't exist.
Yeah, very, very good thoughts. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book by Alvin Weinberg called The First Nuclear Era. It's a bit of an historical one. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not. So what does he put it down to?
What I'm getting at is your remarks about how quickly after the whole idea of fission was understood and appreciated by Fermi in Chicago, University of Chicago, how quickly we started making reactors. I think we might have taken even longer if it hadn't been for Russia. Russia developed actually the first civilian type of nuclear reactor in 1954, 3 years before Sputnik. And nobody much knew about it except for General Eisenhower, who was then president. So I should have called him that. And he called up that famous guy with the submarines, what's his name? Admiral Rickover. And he said, Rickover, I want you to build a civilian nuclear power plant in the United States quick and fast. And so he went to Pennsylvania and found a place there, forgetting the name of the place now. But within 2.5 years, he had that running, and as only Rickover can do. And that whole story is outlined in delightful detail by Weinberg in his book, The First Nuclear Era. I can get you some slides of a talk that I gave on the subject, but it's really delightful reading. I think you would enjoy it.
Yeah. May well plug into that. I was listening to a radio program about the Manhattan Project the other day.
Yes.
The speed and the progress was blinding compared with the progress that we had. It's just hugely ironic in so many ways.
So true. And people say that we should use that military fervor that we had following Pearl Harbor to develop nuclear plants. Well, that would be nice. I can't quite see it happening, but it would. I think we do need to. I really like your simile of giving the seeds of ideas and information and putting them in fertile ground and spreading them. I find that when I'm talking to people, anybody I meet, I often ask them just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on nuclear power or nuclear energy? And I find that I can divide them into two classes. Those over 50 are hesitant, and those under 50 are much more willing to accept it. And I don't know if my personal census has any value in the real public, or whether it's just an impression, but I kind of think that our younger people are not as rigid in their acceptance of nuclear energy as people who perhaps remember 3 Mile Island too well, or the movie The China Syndrome, and just can't get over the emotionality of those things. But in any case, we do need to plant the seeds of information on fertile ground, and I hope we've accomplished that today, and that all of our listeners will continue to spread the word. And meanwhile, I'll take the liberty of thanking you again. It's 11:45 our time and 1:45 your time.
Quick stats program for because I'm speaking again on a different subject, because I'm now worried that I bored everybody silly and they're asleep, which is why we're not getting any questions.
No.
I'm going to, after this finishes, I'm going to try and convince myself that I covered the subjects so comprehensively that I answered all the questions.
That could be. I think that could well be.
I'm going to come back and talk about two things. One is that there is a lot of people know about nuclear power, but I have a contention that we could not run a modern society without all of the other things that the nuclear industry brings to us, of which most people are blissfully ignorant. So I'm going to walk through a day in my life in which I'm going to touch on all of the technologies. And I'm just going to leave my bedroom before I see the first nuclear technology that I'm almost entirely dependent upon. So that's going to be one part of the presentation. And the second part is an area of interest that I've developed recently about conspiracy theories, which are used a lot within the nuclear industry. And that's where I started getting interested, but is now running rampant with the way tricks are played to misuse information to try and lead people to a way of thinking. And that we are seeing with, dare I say it, COVID-19 and some of the conspiracies that are arising there. So I'm going to touch on that subject, an amateur view of how the magician's tricks are used to mislead people in conveying information. So I'm hoping those are going to be interesting topics and that'll both entertain and inform people.
I'm so grateful that you're coming to do that, Neil, and thank you so much for the introduction to 2 weeks from today. 1 week from today, we'll be talking about the contributions of agriculture to carbon emissions and ways that we might reduce that. I have a couple of panelists writing in saying, wonderful talk, thanks a lot. So you are appreciated, Neil, and we look forward so much to 2 weeks from today. Thank you again so much. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye to everybody. Now, I will end this first and then